The Deposit, Part 1. Just a Woman with a Check. Branch manager Todd Harmon liked to say he could read a room, a phrase he used often, usually right before making a judgment about someone that had nothing to do with anything they'd actually said or done. 12 years running the Meridian Trust branch on 5th and Colby had convinced him his instincts about people were sharper than most. And nothing in those 12 years had ever forced him to seriously reconsider that belief, mostly because the people his instincts targeted rarely had the standing to push back. The woman who walked in that Tuesday afternoon didn't look, to Harmon's eye, like she belonged in the marble-floored lobby of a bank that prided itself on serving the city's oldest money. She wore a plain gray hoodie under a worn denim jacket, sneakers that had seen better years, and carried a canvas tote bag instead of a purse. She was black, somewhere in her 50s, with silver threading through natural hair pulled back in a simple bun, and she moved through the lobby with an unhurried, quiet confidence that Harmon, in his private accounting, mistook for something else entirely. She approached the teller window and slid a check across the counter, a cashier's check, drawn on an out-of-state account, for a little over $240,000. The teller, a young woman named Priya Nathan, who had been working the branch for less than a year, blinked at the number twice before she found her voice. "I'll just need a form of ID to process this, ma'am." The woman produced a driver's license without comment, and Priya, still faintly unsettled by the size of the check, did what any properly trained teller would do with a deposit of that size from a new customer. She flagged it for manager review, a routine step for any transaction above a certain threshold. Nothing unusual, nothing that should have taken more than a few minutes to clear. It took Todd Harmon considerably longer than a few minutes to decide what he thought was happening. He studied the check, studied the woman through the reinforced glass separating his office from the lobby floor, and arrived, within about 90 seconds, at a conclusion built entirely out of assumptions he'd never bothered to examine. An older black woman in worn clothes, presenting a check for nearly $250,000, drawn on an account he didn't recognize, at a branch she'd never used before. In Harmon's mental ledger, that combination added up to exactly one thing, and it wasn't legitimate. "I want to see her ID and the check myself," he told Priya, stepping out of his office. "And pull up whatever account history we have." There was no account history. She wasn't a customer of this branch. That, too, registered in Harmon's calculus as confirmation, rather than the entirely unremarkable fact that it was. After all, people opened new accounts at new branches every day, and a large check from an unfamiliar institution was routine business for exactly the kind of private wealth management division Meridian Trust maintained on its top floor. A division Harmon had spent 12 years managing a branch beneath, without ever once being invited to understand how it actually operated. "Ma'am," he said, approaching the counter with the practiced, condescending patience he reserved for situations like this. "I'm going to need some additional documentation before we can process a check of this size. Do you have anything showing the source of these funds?" "The check is drawn on a verified institutional account," the woman said, her voice calm, unbothered, carrying the particular, even tone of someone who had encountered this exact flavor of scrutiny more times in her life than she cared to count. "It's a cashier's check. It doesn't require a source of funds document. Your own compliance policy for cashier's checks under $500,000 only requires ID verification and standard hold procedures." Harmon blinked, caught slightly off guard by the specificity of her answer. The kind of specificity that should have told him something, if he'd been inclined to actually listen, rather than simply wait for his turn to speak. "I'm aware of our own policy," he said, though something in his tone suggested he was, in fact, improvising. "I still need to verify this isn't fraudulent before I can authorize a deposit this size." "Then verify it. Call the issuing institution, the numbers printed at the bottom of the check." "I'll decide how I verify it." He took the check, took her license, and disappeared into the back office for nearly 20 minutes, ostensibly making calls, though the woman waiting patiently at the counter understood, with the particular weary clarity of someone who had lived this exact scenario before under different circumstances, that what was actually happening in that back office had considerably less to do with verification and considerably more to do with a manager working himself up toward a decision he'd already made before he'd walked through that door. He came back with two things: her license and a security guard. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to step aside while we sort this out. My security officer here is going to hold onto your check and your ID until we've confirmed everything checks out." That's not how a hold works, and I think you know that. You process the deposit with a standard hold period, or you decline it and return my documents. You don't confiscate a customer's identification because you've decided, without evidence, that something looks wrong to you. I've got reasonable suspicion of check fraud, and that gives me the authority to hold both the check and your ID pending investigation. What, specifically, is your reasonable suspicion based on? He didn't have an answer he was willing to say out loud, because the honest answer had nothing to do with the check itself, which was, in every material respect, exactly what it appeared to be, and everything to do with a woman in a hoodie and worn sneakers, presenting a sum of money that didn't match Harmon's private, unexamined assumptions about who got to walk into his branch carrying that kind of number. "I think you need to leave the premises," he said instead, "while we sort this out through proper channels." "I'm not leaving without my ID." "Then I'm going to have security escort you out, and you can collect it from our fraud department once this clears." The security guard, a heavy-set man named Otis Bramwell, who had worked this branch for 6 years and had, in that time, developed a quiet but real discomfort with exactly this kind of escalation, hesitated before stepping forward, his eyes flicking between Harmon's rigid certainty and the calm, unshaken composure of the woman standing at the counter. A composure that struck him, the longer he watched it, as belonging to someone who understood a great deal more about this situation than either he or Harmon currently did. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to come with me," Bramwell said, his voice apologetic in a way that Harmon's had not been. She looked at him, then at Harmon, and something in her expression shifted. Not into anger, but into the flat, deliberate patience of a woman who had decided, in that moment, that she had given this particular institution exactly as much benefit of the doubt as it deserved. "Before you touch me," she said quietly, "I want you both to understand something. In about 4 minutes, several things are going to happen very quickly. And I want you to remember, when they do, that I gave you every opportunity to handle this correctly, and you chose not to." Harmon laughed, a short, dismissive sound. "Is that a threat?" "It's a courtesy," she said, "which is more than you gave me." Part 2. The call nobody expected. Bramwell walked her gently toward the branch's front doors, not with force, not with the rough handling the scene might have called for in a different telling, but with the reluctant, uncomfortable motions of a man who suspected, even as he did it, that he was making a mistake he wouldn't fully understand the size of until much later. The woman didn't resist. She simply reached into her canvas tote bag, retrieved a phone, and made a call while Bramwell escorted her toward the exit, her voice calm and unhurried in a way that unsettled him more than shouting would have. "It's me," she said when the call connected. "I'm at the 5th and Colby branch. The manager here just had me removed from the lobby and confiscated my ID over a routine cashier's check deposit. I want compliance and legal on this in the next 10 minutes, and I want the branch's full transaction and complaint history pulled before anyone here has a chance to revise their story." A brief pause, someone speaking urgently on the other end. "No, I'm fine. I want this handled exactly the way we discussed if something like this ever happened. Quietly at first. Let's see how deep it runs before anyone here understands who they were dealing with." She hung up, and Bramwell, standing beside her near the branch's front doors, felt a small, cold certainty settle into his stomach, the particular dread of a man who has just overheard someone give an order rather than make a plea. "Mom," he said quietly. "Who was that?" "Someone who's about to make Mr. Harmon's afternoon considerably more complicated than he's currently anticipating." They didn't have to wait long. 12 minutes later, a black sedan pulled up outside the branch, and two people in sharply tailored business attire stepped out. A man in his 40s, with the brisk, unhurried authority of someone accustomed to rooms rearranging themselves around him, and a younger woman, carrying a tablet and a leather folio, both of them moving through the branch's front doors with a purposefulness that made every teller behind the counter go quiet at once. "I need to speak with the branch manager," the man said to the first employee he encountered. "Immediately." Todd Harmon emerged from his office at the sound of the commotion, still riding the satisfied momentum of a decision he believed he'd handled correctly, and felt that satisfaction curdle the moment he registered who was standing in his lobby. "Mr. Alvarez," he said, recognition and confusion crossing his face in quick succession. "Regional compliance doesn't usually... Is there a problem?" "There's a considerable problem, Todd, and it's standing about 10 feet behind me." Alvarez gestured toward the woman in the hoodie, still waiting patiently near the front doors beside a visibly unsettled Bramwell. "Do you know who that is?" "She's a customer who tried to deposit a check with no verifiable source, and when I attempted to follow standard fraud procedure, she became..." "She's Ilana Marsh," Alvarez said, and the name landed across the lobby with the particular physical weight of a dropped object. "Chief Executive Officer of Meridian Trust's parent holding company. The check she deposited today is drawn on the private foundation account she personally chairs, and she has spent the last 4 months conducting an unannounced, in-person review of branch-level customer treatment across this region, specifically focused on complaints alleging discriminatory account scrutiny that this bank's internal compliance division had, on 6 separate prior occasions, closed without meaningful investigation." Harmon's face went through several rapid transformations, and none of them landed anywhere close to composure. She wasn't dressed like... There's no way she's the... She dressed exactly the way she intended to dress, Todd, because the entire point of the review was to observe how this branch treated a customer who didn't look, on the surface, like the kind of customer you assumed deserved your courtesy. And in the space of about 25 minutes, you confiscated her identification, had her physically removed from the lobby, and did it all in front of 2 employees who are, at this very moment, giving statements to compliance that corroborate every word of what she just reported. The lobby had gone entirely silent, the handful of customers and tellers present, understanding, with the particular collective clarity of people watching a slow-motion collapse, that they were witnessing the end of something that had probably been building for a very long time. Part 3. What 6 complaints bought him. The internal investigation moved with a speed that Harmon, even in his rapidly unraveling certainty, hadn't anticipated. Propelled by the simple fact that the woman he'd humiliated in his own lobby held enough institutional authority to ensure it moved exactly as fast as she wanted it to. "I want to understand something," Ilana Marsh said, seated across from Harmon and his union representative 2 days later, in a conference room considerably quieter than the chaos of the branch lobby had been. 6 prior complaints over 4 years, all alleging some version of exactly what happened to me on Tuesday. A customer, disproportionately older, disproportionately not white, treated with suspicion disproportionate to any actual irregularity in their transaction. All 6 closed by your branch's own internal review, citing insufficient evidence. Can you explain to me how that happens 6 times? Harmon's representative, a compliance-side attorney named Gareth Voss, who had clearly already understood before the meeting began that there wasn't a meaningful defense to construct here, offered the only thing he had. "Mr. Harmon has a strong record of transaction accuracy and fraud prevention across 12 years with the branch. There's no indication his conduct on Tuesday was motivated by anything beyond standard. His conduct on Tuesday is recorded, in full, on this branch's own security footage, along with audio from the lobby microphones, Marsh said, sliding a tablet across the table. The screen already paused on a frame of Harmon's face mid-sentence, mouth open, finger extended toward the door. I'd invite you to review it before finishing that sentence, because it doesn't support the version of events you're describing. He asked me, on camera, for documentation our own written policy explicitly does not require. When I cited that policy back to him accurately, he escalated to confiscating my identification and ordering my physical removal. A decision your own security officer, Mr. Bramwell, has already stated in writing he found unjustified in the moment it happened. Harmon said nothing. There was nothing left to say. The instinct he'd trusted for 12 years, the one that told him, within 90 seconds of watching a woman walk through his lobby, exactly what kind of person she must be, had simply never been tested against an institution with any real appetite for testing it, until the day it collided, by pure and catastrophic chance, with the one person in the entire company whose word could not be dismissed, disputed, or quietly filed away. He was terminated by the end of the week, the bank's board moving with a swiftness clearly calculated to limit the reputational damage of a story that had, by then, begun circulating well beyond the branch itself. A bystander's phone video of the confrontation, uploaded within hours of the incident, had already accumulated hundreds of thousands of views by the time Marsh's identity became public knowledge, transforming what might have been a quiet institutional correction into a story the bank could no longer manage privately. I want to be direct about what happens next, Marsh said, in a statement released alongside the bank's announcement of Harmon's termination. This isn't simply the story of one manager making a bad decision about one customer. It's the story of 6 prior customers who reported nearly identical treatment and who were told, each time, that there wasn't sufficient evidence to act. There was sufficient evidence. There was a pattern visible the moment anyone bothered to actually look for it. What was missing wasn't evidence. It was a customer whose complaint the institution felt it couldn't afford to dismiss. The bank's board, under mounting public pressure, commissioned an independent audit of complaint handling practices across all 41 of its branches. An audit that would, over the following year, surface a pattern uncomfortably similar to the one at Fifth and Colby repeated at 11 additional locations, and result in a company-wide overhaul of how discrimination complaints were investigated, including a new policy requiring any complaint alleging discriminatory treatment to be reviewed by a party entirely outside the branch in question, rather than the branch's own manager investigating himself. 6 months later, Ilana Marsh sat in her office on the top floor of the bank's headquarters, the floor Todd Harmon had spent 12 years managing a branch beneath, without ever once understanding what actually happened up there. Reviewing the first quarterly report from the new Independent Complaint Review Division her intervention had created. The report showed 43 flagged incidents across the company's branches in the preceding quarter, 12 of them substantiated and resulting in disciplinary action, a number that would have been, under the old system, quietly reduced to 0 through the same institutional reflex that had protected Todd Harmon for 6 complaints and 4 years before his instincts finally collided with someone he couldn't talk his way around. She thought, sometimes, about the hoodie she'd worn that Tuesday, and the canvas tote bag, and the worn sneakers. Not a disguise, exactly, though it had certainly functioned as one, but simply the clothes she'd have worn on an ordinary Tuesday, running an ordinary errand, if she hadn't happened to also be the one person in the company with the authority to make an institution answer for a pattern it had spent years finding reasons to ignore. I get asked, sometimes, whether I planned that exact confrontation, she told the business journalist, in the single interview she gave about the incident. I didn't plan Todd Harmon specifically. I planned to walk into branches, unannounced, dressed the way I'd normally dress, and see what happened. What happened at Fifth and Colby wasn't an aberration I got unlucky enough to encounter. It was the thing the 6 prior complaints had already been describing, precisely, for 4 years. I didn't create that pattern by walking into that lobby. I simply became, for once, a customer the institution couldn't afford to dismiss, the way it had dismissed everyone before me. That's not justice, exactly. Justice would have been believing the first customer who complained. This was just the moment the pattern finally became impossible to ignore. She closed the quarterly report, made a note in the margin about 2 branches that would need a follow-up visit. Dressed, she decided, exactly the way she'd dressed the first time, and moved on to the next item on a list that she understood, better than anyone in the building, was nowhere close to finished. The end.